Alright, hey y'all. I'm here today with Andrew Woods. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello.
I won't introduce you. You introduce yourself. Whatever you want to say.
Well, I'm Andrew Woods, and I met David in a class about, among other thinkers, Hannah Arendt, and we're going to discuss the human condition now, one of her more famous works, which I've leafed through for the fourth time in my life. I had two professors in my masters who were absolutely obsessed with this book, and sort of passed on their love for Arendt onto me. So I think that we'll probably have some fun going through it again, I guess.
Yeah, this is a book I've come back to a number of times.
Mm-hmm.
Oddly enough, the first time I read it was in like high school, because I had a teacher, my basketball coach, who told me to read it. I didn't understand a thing, but anyways, yeah. So you're a doctoral candidate now, or doctoral student.
Indeed, doctoral student.
Yeah, and what is your research like broadly?
My research is into the work of Simone Weil and also post-autonomous thinkers like Franco Berardi, Maurizio Lazzarato, Silvia Federici, Paolo Werner.
Continental.
Yeah, pretty heavily continental. Really like talking about the future, and there are sort of Arendt gets into that a bit in this book with, the promise and unpredictability, which which is a concept that I kind of butchered in my master's thesis.
Really?
Yeah. No, I didn't use the promise the way that she wanted it to be used, but I think that it gives you a sense of what this conversation is going to be like.
Yeah.
I don't think Arendt would be happy about the way that I did. Arendt.
I feel like Arendt, of all the thinkers we kind of explore here, is a pretty stringent one. You don't want to get outside the boundaries of where her mind was at. But that's a good place to start. And thinking about the prologue, she does spend a good deal of time on this thing called the future, or whatever will culminate into the future, with regards to satellites, or thinking about the way in which satellites either mark something of a progression in this thing called the human condition, or moving beyond it. And I was wondering what you thought about that specifically.
Well, it's definitely a book written under the shadow of one, Sputnik, and also the mushroom cloud of Hiroshima, really. And she explores what these two events mean for the human condition in another essay called The Conquest of Man, The Conquest of Space and the Statue of Man.
Was that a standalone essay? Or
no, this appeared in Between Past and Future, and she kind of flips the assumption of going to space being this transcending of the human condition, and a way to make man more powerful and greater, into something that actually makes humans appear a lot smaller, because they're no longer earth-bound, no longer in this environment that gives them this kind of proportions. They've become creatures of the universe, and because the universe is so vast, the stature of humanity has been greatly reduced. And she touches on this in the human condition with the idea of the Archimedean point.
Yeah.
And where contemporary science has taken us to a situation where we're no longer confined to Earth, but are capable of introducing processes that occur in the universe into the human space.
Yeah, and how that Archimedean point existing necessarily outside of the parameters of what we consider Earth, how in that is it operates as a sort of mirror, where there is that thing in space that almost gives us a point of reference from which to analyze ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this comes out in many different forms, especially today, thinking about satellites,
Mm-hmm.
like in which, and you get all the surveillance arguments about that. But in what way, even thinking about cell phones or communication more broadly, in what way does I guess, ironically, the way that we were able to connect to ourselves, humans broadly, with other humans across the globe more easily, was for us to find a way outside of the globe, quite ironically, how that worked out. But it's really interesting that thinking about the future, thinking about technology, are elements of a book titled The Human Condition. Because it would seem as though, for me at least, thinking about technology would mark something of a, the Heideggerian negative ontology, or moving necessarily into a very non-human conditioned space.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything for you that would explain why she throws that into the prologue? Like, what is it about this event that propels this book, or starts it out for us? Big question, I know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd say that it's linked to what she says about action, and how it has this process character of how scientists no longer observe natural phenomena, but introduce processes or provoke processes through their experiments, through their discoveries, and what they perceive as truth is what humankind can make. And with Sputnik, it's an addition. It's a new condition that's no longer within the world, because for Arendt, an important aspect of the Homo faber, of fabrication of work, is this construction of the world as opposed to the earth. So what does it mean to have this work, this action that takes place outside the boundaries of what's always been considered as the world? And I think when she writes in the prologue, she talks about a particular line that came from the interview of mankind will not remain bound to the earth forever. And then on the very next page she writes, the earth is the very quintessence of the human condition.
Yeah.
It's a way of I mean, let me put this another way. The human condition is very much the work of an intellectual historian, I think, and also has this kind of elegiac quality to it of we are losing the structure of the active life that has persisted with us since ancient times.
Right.
And what does this mean for us? Because throughout the book, it seems like every activity within the active life has just been dislodged from its proper place.
Yep.
She talks. She discusses the interdependence of labor, work, and action, which are the main categories she uses for the active life throughout the book. And she says that labor is redeemed by work, which erects a world of durability, because the main problem of labor is that it's an entirely cyclical process, and it wears down. It wears down durability. It increases consumption, which means that objects are more disposable, and the redemption of the redemption of work from meaninglessness, of being constantly stuck in this means ends mentality of everything can be used as a means for something else, is from action, which is using speech and action, like lexis and praxis, to imbue things with meaning. So she sees the human condition as a kind of ecosystem, and Sputnik and the introduction of action into natural processes in contemporary science is a threat to that, I think.
Yeah.
For her.
So that'd be a good. Now, she lays out three fundamental things, right, that make up this thing called the human condition that stands somewhat opposed to, I guess, the shift in this Archimedean point, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But these three things are, very simply, labor, work, and action. I feel you and I we can breeze right through that, like whatever those three things are, and they're quick kind of definitions. And she lays them out very quickly right at the beginning, where labor corresponds to the fundamental biological necessities of life, the shitting, the eating, the copulation, stuff like that would make it so that you weren't able to live if you, one might argue you weren't living if you weren't conducting the other things as well, but you would perish as a human being if you did not do that.
Yes, certainly.
Following that, we have work. Now this for me is the trickiest one to kind of grasp, because for me it blends between labor, or this and labor, work and labor, kind of fold together at certain points. Where for me it would appear as though those things are not labor. Sorry, I meant to say action. Where those things that are often conceived as like political acts, especially in the consideration in feminist thought, where the private is the political, or anything that would go on in one's own private life can then be construed as the political. It would seem as though work and action share some affinities with one another. But for the sake of this here, work is how one engages with the world through words and deeds, or is that through toil? Through
fabrication.
Through fabrication.
Through building durable objects in the world that constitute the world.
Tilling the soil.
Tilling the soil for her is this example of labor that constitutes a work. It's this cyclical activity that actually creates something durable in the world. Yeah.
But yet it is wholly necessary in many cases, thinking about something like, I don't know, the necessity for shelter, or something like that demands work, right? In order to maintain that. So that's quite simply what work is. And then action is, that political thinking, autonomous sort of subject in the vita activa, or the vita contemplativa, that is just pretty well the person that, thinking about the ancient Greeks in the polis and what it necessarily meant to be an active agent in something called the political realm, or something of to be among other people. So we have, starting out right at the first chapter, these three things. Now, what is it about labor, just to start out quite simply, that she gives it that sort of quality? Like, that she says labor is that thing that is universal to everyone, and in that way, does it then correspond to a primary element to this triad here of the human condition, or is it something that is not wholly necessary for the realization of the other two? So in that way, is there like a telos?
I certainly feel like they're all connected. That you can't have any of them without the other. I mean, she goes on to explain this in more depth in the public and the private realm. And on the next page in the introduction, she talks about how they are linked to birth and death, natality and mortality, and labor is the activity that ensures the one individual survival and life of the species. With work, it's more about permanence, that combats the futility of life, the fact that we're going to die, It gives us a sense that our life's going to mean something, that people are going to be living in this sort of same space and will remember us. And this is also how it links in with action too, because the people who inhabit this permanent space are able to remember what came before and, in a sense, create history. And for Arendt, it's not the kind of Hegelian understanding of history as process, it's the understanding of history as a sequence of events or actions. So it's not like the dialectic of the world spirit as it occurs. I think I've just completely stormed past what you asked.
I think my question was rather obscure, but I'm interested in what you said there, making a distinction between the Hegelian notion of the dialectic with this.
Mm-hmm.
When you said that for Arendt you believe that history was a sequence of actions, or in almost those words, do you mean action in the way that she states it here, where it's almost those moments of greatness? Or those moments
it's all about arete, excellence.
Right, excellence, that's a better word.
So it's these words and deeds and works, and she talks about it later in the book, where the deeds of great people, when they're in the course, or while they're happening, aren't really understood, and they need to be it needs to be studied by the historian in order for those deeds to make sense.
Right.
And this relationship between the work and action of the historian, the artist, are able to commemorate or memorialize the greatness of these historical figures.
Right, and it is almost as though culture, and I'll use that term really broadly, is founded upon these instances, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whatever would consider, moving from one episteme to the next, has some indubitable affinity with whatever was going on as far as great works of art or anything like that were concerned. We think about the shifts in, like, I don't know, in art from the Gothic to whatever you might have there. But there seems like, and the Marxists, the Marxists would hate that, right? Because then it's like, well, what about the real labor that goes on behind such a thing? And she gets into Marx here in her own way, but it would seem like certainly a disavowal of that side of history, right? Of what's going on in the realm of labor, or those people who can't engage in action. To which I don't know how Arendt would respond.
Well, I mean, Arendt is very conscious of that in the public and private realm, because her whole argument about labour and the household is that there need to be people taking care of of life itself before other people are able to participate in action. So it's. I mean, and she talks about the pre-political realm as being violent, as being full of force, and the violence being the foundation of the equality and plurality of the polis.
Right. And when we're thinking about this in terms of the Greeks, we're thinking specifically of Aristotle.
Very much Aristotle. She's very ferociously critical of Plato.
Yeah, I wonder why. Well, actually, why do you think that is?
Because with Plato is a philosopher who tried to bring in the work of fabrication into the sphere of action. And he's for Arendt and for Aristotle to a certain degree. I mean, I feel like Arendt definitely romanticizes Aristotle to a degree. Um,
Yeah, at least.
with Plato, there's a relationship between, there's a hierarchy between those people who know and those that do. Like with the philosopher kings, and then there's the guardians, and also the other people who participate in this ideal city that Socrates imagines in the Republic. And for Arendt, they're in the sphere of politics and the sphere of action. You can't make up the rules because the lawgiver is actually someone who participates in fabrication rather than action, and you can't be ruled because that means that you would be under some kind of necessity.
Right.
So you need to have freedom if you're going to participate in the public sphere, if you're going to be a person of action. Whereas with Plato, it's all about the person who makes the rules and the people who have to follow the rules.
The shoemaker is going to be the shoemaker for their whole lives, and it's quite as simple as that.
But I mean, the people who are ruling the Republic are following the same model as the shoemaker. It's all about this idea, and the philosopher king needs to execute this idea in real life.
Yeah.
Which is what the Homo Faber does. They take the idea of a table and they turn it into the material. And they use the material to turn it into a real table.
Right, exactly. So the two texts in contrast would be the Republic and then politics.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's an interesting moment, though, in politics when Aristotle, when he's kind of outlining the two different spheres, or the two different realms, the public and the private, he states that there is supposed to be present in, for example, the public, some components of the private. So that's sort of whatever we'd consider to be indicative of the private realm, notably a sort of autonomy, sort of an ability to exert a sort of authority or speech in order to demonstrate one's point, is necessary for the maintenance of a sort of like a hierarchization within the home, the oikos, which for Aristotle, at least for me, is something of an interesting point. So when Arendt conceives of this thing called the social, it seems as though it was always moving towards that to some degree, right? So the social is that sort of dissipation of that distinction between the public and the private in favor of, the end of excellence, right? Just the sort of broad institutional mediocrity all around, perhaps in some sense, the realization of the Republic, to the nth factor. I don't know if you want to think about that for a moment, or you have a bunch of notes. I mean, I'll say this right here. If you want to talk about anything chronologically, I mean, I'm not opposed to
No, I like the wandering discussion a little more. In the Rise of the Social section, I mean, it's about the disappearance of the polis, which is the space where equality was possible because the private realm was hidden away in the household, and the household's all about inequality and violence and hierarchy. And so for Arendt, the Rise of the Social is a shift from this very rigid public-private distinction toward society, a distinction between society and intimacy. And with intimacy, it's all about the heart, all about the emotions, which was not what the household was about at all. And society is the administration of society, and it's all about administration, as if everyone who belongs to this particular society had the same interest. And she discusses how the aim of labour shifted from equilibrium, or to make sure that the people who participate in the public realm had enough to keep that, to maintain that role, toward expansion, which links to her distinction between property and wealth, because when the public realm existed, or the polis in her eyes, private property was merely a way just to have a fixed point in the world, and everything that happened on that private property was a means to participate in the public sphere. And with wealth, for the shift to wealth, it's just the aim of that is exponential growth. So you want more money. I mean, it's like the basic formula of capital, of like money and then commodity, and to make more money. So where was I? That's one of the shifts that happens with the rise of the social. Another thing is that behavior replaces action, so it's no longer about this pursuit of excellence. It's all about conformity rather than distinction.
Right.
And she writes about statistics as not being a reflection of what's really going on, but also a way to determine what's normal and what's abnormal.
Right, and that statistics is just one example. Is an apparatus that not only homogenizes its object of study, that would imply that a random select group is then representative of the whole, but it does affirm in some sense the very capacity for that very scientific observation, right? Mm-hmm. The ability to say, I have this method, and this method is going to do this, and then this is going to give us this result, but it's a result that's often already known in advance, right? Because statistics don't necessarily just present some kind of neutral fact, but they actually operate to confirm or to affirm, reaffirm the very need for statistics in a sense, the maintenance of that sort of that institution or that apparatus, that assemblage that is part and parcel of that sort of scientific component we were speaking about at the beginning. But to what extent then, if we think about, actually, you know what? I'll wait. What do you have something to add to that?
No, I'm intrigued about this question.
Well, it's not a great question, but I was wondering about the man as social animal, or man as political animal, or man as action animal.
Oh, yeah, it's what's the name of that section there? It's like social or political animal.
Yeah, it's a man, a social or a political animal.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
That's the question.
I was wondering what you thought about that. Because if we would think man is a political animal, that is coming right out of Aristotle. But man as a social animal is it's a little bit more complicated, because that would imply the sort of realization of Arendt's theorization of that social realm coming into fruition. Where, thinking about that, just from the title alone, we get into a rather interesting territory.
So she's talking about a mistranslation that carries over to the work of Aquinas, who was influential, and where he's comparing the head of the household to the head of the kingdom, of the king. So there's this premonition of the social as administration, as this view of society as an entity that has a single interest. And that's the distinction between the social and the political animal, I suppose, because for her politics means plurality, whereas the social means a kind of unity in the sense of conformity, in a sense of behavior over action.
Right. Right. So that I want to pick out a passage here from the section dealing with the rise of the social.
Which page are you on?
41 in my version. 41. It'll probably be something.
They all have the same, even though they're different editions. It's the same pages. in each
Really?
one, which is kind of very convenient.
Oh, that is good. Where it goes, the rise of mass society, on the contrary, only indicates. Actually, I should say the.
Yeah, no. Oh no, actually, yeah, no. For a second, I was totally bullshitting. It's the different page.
No,
now I know what you're talking about.
What matters is this equation with social status, and it is immaterial whether the framework happens to be actual rank in the half-feudal society of the 18th century, title in the class society of the 19th, or mere function in the mass society of today. The rise of mass society, on the contrary, only indicates that the various social groups have suffered the same absorption into one society that the family units had suffered earlier. With the emergence of mass society, the realm of the social has finally, after several centuries of development, reached the point where it embraces and controls all members of a given community, equally and with equal strength. What's wrong with that? I mean, is there anything wrong with this thing called equality?
So it's a different kind of equality to what
tell me about it. I mean, because you think.
Well, I mean, that's the strange thing with what Arendt says about action. I mean, if you go straight to the section on action, the first thing she says about it is like, I keep on flipping past it. Yeah, the human plurality, basic condition of both action and speech, as a twofold character of equality and distinction. Whereas back in the private and public realm section, she's like, no, there needs to be these slaves in the household, and there needs to be this sort of violence going on in this sort of pre-political realm for equality to exist at all.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
When you read those two sections in conjunction, you're like, well, there's an irony here of this political realm where people can be equals is predicated on inequality.
Yeah.
And I suppose for Arendt, the rebuttal she'd have to what's wrong with the kind of equality in mass society is, well, what can most people do with that equality? It's like the classic Marxist critique of freedom under capitalism, of you are free, but you're also free to starve, and you don't have the sort of material resources to use this equal status in the same way as it was intended in the ancient world. Which is not to say that, mass enfranchisement was a bad idea.
Yeah.
But she's conscious of the ways that these concepts have evolved over time,
right.
And
right.
What's lost in the way that production has developed, or how different spheres of the vita activa have gained dominance over the course of history, and how that affects the concepts and the lexicon that we use to discuss politics.
Yeah. So, if might just back up a couple of steps, the vita activa, what is that?
The vita activa is the opposite of the vita contemplativa.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
She writes about how the vita activa really becomes defined in the conflict between the philosopher and the polis, and with Socrates. And I mean, especially in Plato, it's the activities of life that make the vita contemplativa possible, or that interrupts contemplation. So it's the kind of negative of this. Well, she talks about contemplation as the complete cessation of activity. So the active life is all of the activities that one would be doing if one wasn't contemplating.
Right.
And for her, the active life, in the way that it's been conceptualized from Plato to Aristotle to Augustine to Aquinas, has lost all of these kind of specialized distinctions within itself. So it became identified as just activity in general, or busybodiness.
Yeah.
And in that tradition, it's usually denigrated. In the same way that, in rationalism, there's this dichotomy between reason and the passions. So it's kind of similar to that in some way, I'd say. And with those kind of dichotomies, all of the variation within those concepts sort of gets lost. So her project in this book is to specify the distinctions between the different levels of the Vida Activa, and also place them on an even footing with contemplation,
Right.
and to show that philosophy is also a part. Philosophy and doing aren't that different.
Yeah.
And I mean, my favorite section in this book is my favorite section in the books, the permanence of the world and the work of art, where she talks about thought and cognition and logic, and she also discusses this in the prologue too, and the distinction between eternity and immortality, but how the philosopher must always be a part of the world to share their thoughts with others, and in any way, the primary way they're able to share these ideas is through writing, which is the act of cognition, which is a type of work. It's putting words together to convey your notions. And I think this is how she conceives of her own work too, because her proposal in the prologue of the Human Condition is that very simply she wants to think through what we're doing. So I think within the course of the Human Condition, she's also grappling with what her role is in society in general.
I'm, for my own part, am really interested in this idea of immortality and eternity.
Oh yeah.
So what distinction can we draw between the two, and then between the two, from them, in the distinction between them and mortality? And what role, or how does that relate to the shift from the distinction between the public and the private into the social?
Mm-hmm.
Where for me it seems as though, right, eternity or immortality didn't have anything to do with the body, where like the body would live on, but rather it was how the being able to engage in some kind of meaningful political matter allowed the name, right?
Yeah.
As it allowed something to continue on, or that allowing for that excellence that could keep going. Whereas in the social, or in this sort of equalization, sure, yeah, you're free to do whatever you want. You're also free to starve. You're free to say whatever you want, but you're also free to be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
But quite simply, where it becomes not a matter of being a part of a world of meaning, but being part of a world of nothingness. And it's in that way, like, okay, well,
yeah.
Get at me for it.
Not nothingness necessarily. It's just life. Life is the highest good in that sort of society.
In the social?
In the social, I think, and it's all about the prolongation of mortality.
Yeah.
And even Illich writes about this in the medical nemesis, of how the medical establishments just corrupt for making people live longer lives than they should.
Now, could we say then that these developments in like medical science or whatever, or even biopolitics, this sort of obsession with the prolongation of life, is a sort of compensatory, sort of compensation for that loss of immortality or eternity in being a political agent or being a Vita?
Yeah. Oh, that's very perspicacious. I think that, I mean, it's Walt Disney being frozen is a kind of parody of what immortality should be.
Yeah. You're not here, but you're
exactly,
here.
yeah.
Like you're
Indeed, you're still alive. I'd be curious. I mean, what would Baudrillard? I mean, but Baudrillard's definitely sort of written about like how that idea to sort of prolong life, and especially Walt Disney too, of sort of being frozen. How
he writes about that specifically. He says he makes a kind of a quip about it. He says. Maybe we should do to criminals what we've done to Walt Disney. We freeze them until we find out what sentence they should get, or what until we learn what justice is, and then we'll unfreeze them and we'll apply the justice to them. I think he would say that it, like as I just presented it, it is something of a strategy employed by a sort of simulacral system intended to convince us of our sort of humanity, or that thing we haven't lost. So I think that Hannah Arendt is really laying out like a base of what constitutes a sort of humanity, at least for like thousands of years. Being like a political agent, being an agent that engaged with the world in some sort of, either through words and deeds or through tilling the soil or toil, which is something that we compensate for through various means, right? And it's an example I've given many times, but in the thing like sexuality, we pretend we haven't lost this thing called sexuality, or that it hasn't undergone a radical change by bombarding ourselves with like pornography or something like that.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. To the nth power.
Yeah.
But it's in that way that I kind of think about that shift from immortality to mortality, or what we are doing today in the wake of the social, or if we could say we've even moved beyond that, maybe.
But it strikes me that in post-apocalyptic films, no one really cares about being remembered. of like people are reduced to this the bare life. It's all about competition with one another. It's either I'm going to eat you or you're going to eat me.
Yeah.
And this is what life as the highest good really means.
Yeah.
It means that I want to live. Yeah. And your death is the foundation of my life.
Exactly.
And it's all about mortality. Mortality is prioritized. Immortality requires people who care enough about the world to sort of keep it stable.
That's a good way to put it.
And this is what she writes about in the end of the section on action, about the way to the only thing we can do to deal with unpredictability is the power to promise, and this is why she prefers the idea of the social contract rather than Plato's idea of a system of the ruler and the ruled, because the social contract means that people have enough freedom within these boundaries to act in certain ways, but it means that society won't kind of fall apart. And also it's a way of guaranteeing the future too, which means that people are more comfortable to have these kind of aspirations toward immortality.
Right.
Because if there wasn't a sort of stable political realm or stable public realm, then I mean, what's the point of trying to reach excellence? And that's a critique of the Society of Labourers. It's like, well, as long as we can do enough to stay alive, then that's all life really means to me.
Right, and in her words, there's an interesting moment when she thinks about our relationship to machines in that way, where she says, and this is in the chapter Work, she says, unlike the tools of workmanship, which at every given moment in the work process remain the servants of the machines demand that the laborer serve them, that he adjust the natural rhythm of his body to their mechanical movement. This certainly does not imply that men are such adjust to or become the servants of their machines, but it does mean that as long as the work at the machine lasts, the mechanical processes replace the rhythm of the human body. So there is a very specific shift from a very biologically determined real body that is being screwed up in relation to the machines. And when we think of work in that way, or labor, or what it means to be a laborer today or a worker today, is very different in that way from what we may have thought about it, or how Arendt thought about it in relation to the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
In that there's no relation, like, and this is just Marx in very many ways, like that sort of alienation from the thing you're producing, right? But for Arendt, that it wouldn't be enough if you had some kind of connection, some real fundamental connection to the car you made, right?
Mm-hmm. Simply
Because that doesn't have that connection to the earth that I think in some way she would like to see.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and in that way being a part of something that was very much a continuation or a progression of this thing called the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question now. Is that a fair way to look at the distinction she makes between herself and Marx, or her project in Marx, where she thinks that Marx perhaps doesn't consider that there very much is this human condition, and that simply by attaching a sort of proletarian connection to the objects being produced, or anything of that sort, is not enough in reclaiming, in backpedaling to this point, if it can actually be re-achieved? Or do you think that that's not a fair way to look at her take on Marx?
I think her take on Marx isn't particularly fair. I think this certainly links to the criticism that most people have of Arendt's human condition, which is that the division between labour and work seems kind of arbitrary. I mean, her only proof for it is like there are these two different words in English, French, and German.
Yeah.
That's pretty much her only basis for the entire argument against Marx. And I think that, I mean, what I have here in my copy, I don't know if this is really the best way to conceptualize her criticism of Marx, is that the fact remains that in all stages of his work, Marx defines man as an animal labyrinth and then leads him into a society in which this greatest and most human power is no longer necessary. We are left with the rather distressing alternative between productive slavery and unproductive freedom. So, in the way that Arendt thinks about labour, you can't have that without life itself. And her main criticism of Marx is his belief that you can get rid of labour and you can get rid of work. I don't think that she really deals with Marx's concept of alienation fruitfully.
Right. That's fair. Yeah.
She's more interested in world alienation, which is a different idea. I think. And she doesn't really talk about wages too. I think that, and she discusses money. I mean, she doesn't deal with Marx on Marx's terms, I'd say. But still, I mean, the criticism that she puts forward of Marx and human condition is something that I've never entirely comprehended. It seems like it happens in a different space from where Marx operates. I don't know.
Yeah, because that notion that I don't think that Marx advocates for an end of work totally, right? Because that's totally impossible.
Certainly. Yeah.
I think that she's a very selective reader in that way, and is very much prepared to take those brief moments when it would seem as such.
I think they have two different ideas of what history is.
Okay, like what? I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's distinguished.
What's the Hegel?
It's distinguished in German of like the Historie and Geschichte. Of history is this list of events that have taken place, and what happens in the past has happened in the past. What happens in the present is just what will be future, what will be history eventually. Whereas Geschichte is this idea of history as a process that includes the past, present, and the future, which is for Hegel, in very vulgar terms, like the unfolding of the world spirit. For Marx, it's this. In a kind of mechanical Marxist sense, it's this the unfolding of the contradictions of capital that eventually leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then towards a communist society.
But despite all
this, for Arendt, the idea of history as process is antithetical to what history should be.
So to be a little bit mean to Arendt, I would wonder to what extent the consideration of a sort of symbolic necessity there is. And what I mean by that is almost the level of culture, where these things do vary, like epistemologically, and how work, in like a Marxist sense, like how work, the base, in some way kind of informs the top or the superstructure. So I'd wonder to what extent that work always already plays within the realm of a sort of like cultural understanding that has nothing to do with action per se, right? And this comes down to it'd be the id to the super, or the ego to the superego. It's kind of that in between the id, which is like the basic functions, because I'm also assuming that we've established that the distinction between work and labor isn't all that clear, so I'm kind of blending the two together. So I'm wondering about that sort of middle ground, notably culture, which I think Marx pays much more attention to than Arendt, and I'd wonder to what extent her project actually allows for any sort of analysis that would consider how things are just simply different across time and space, if it does at all. Because for a book titled The Human Condition, it seems oddly Greek.
You mean there are other cultures? That'd be like for Arendt. I mean, the culture is the Greeks, and
I know, and that's slightly concerning. But for her, that's any sort of exertion of a thing called culture, or that thing that I very poorly placed between work and labor and then action, or that thing that sort of is the space around which action takes place, the cultural realm or whatever. How for her, these doesn't matter what form it takes, because in every single situation, there would be that thing called public engagement, in some form, whether it happened around a drumming circle or in the Greek polis or whatever. But it seems too neat in that way, like almost too simple for such a complex thinker, like someone that is very selective, as we said. Her reading of Marx, and it seems like she's very selective in proposing her own philosophy. Is that unfair? Is that am I being too hard on Arendt?
Yeah, I mean,
she can't consider every single situation.
It is a work of. She's working within the history of ideas, and when you start off with the Greeks, then you have to go on through a trajectory through the Romans, and then through Christianity, and then through a bunch of other German thinkers and French thinkers, and I think the only other English thinker she refers to. Actually, no. I mean, is Whitehead American or
I don't know.
English? No clue. Well, I mean, he's called Alfred, so I mean, that seems really British to me. But yeah, Bentham and Whitehead are the only British thinkers she refers to. But I mean, it is just. I mean, she's a European thinker. I mean, she studied with Heidegger and Jaspers. I mean, they're not like the most multicultural philosophers.
What? Really?
So but I think that. I mean, I know that Arendt really would hate the idea that her autobiography was being dragged into her work. This is the work of like a refugee who's living in America at this time of very fast technological advancement.
Yeah.
The rise of mass society, mass culture, the loss of. I mean, this is just on the cusp of postmodernism. So there's this risk of like high culture and low culture being molded. Very close to the hippie movement, rock and roll's starting around now, and so she's someone who comes from this very high European cultural background, who's living in America at the time where what's normally classified as low culture is gaining ground, really. And one of the main conflicts in the human condition is the conflict between durability and disposability of the of work versus labour. And I think that in the human condition, she's trying to defend what European thinkers have thought for in this North American space.
Yeah.
Which is also what Herbert Marcuse does in a subtle way in the One-Dimensional Man. There's this, and which obviously what Adorno and Hawkeye would do too. I think maybe it's a German impulse. If you move to America, you need to have this sort of very high culture stance.
Oh yeah. Like, I hate jazz music, which but
I think I've gone way off topic, but that's almost like a conspiracy theory reading of Hannah Arendt.
But it's good. I